At 0450, the world was a grey smear. Breath hung in the air like a promise. 12 shadows lay in the grass, motionless and small, not birds, not beasts, but programmed things waiting. A single heartbeat later, a column of steel and flesh rolled into the valley. A lifeline of fuel, ammunition, and cold lived in order. The night held its breath. An electronic net had been cast. The trap had teeth. In the space between breath and blast, entire plans unspooled and turned to ash. Picture a simple truth. The cost of a drone can be counted in hundreds. The cost of what it severs can be counted in months or years. Tonight we follow two operations. An ambush on a supply convoy and a coordinated strike on a porton that show how small, inexpensive systems rewire battlefields. Subscribe and follow along. We will bring you the untapped mechanics and the human choices behind the headlines. They had been watching for weeks. From the air, the southern fields of Zaporizhzhia looked ordinary. Patches of dry grass, fractured roads, the occasional line of birch trees scarred by shrapnel. But hidden beneath that landscape was a patient network of eyes. The operation that would one day turn this road into an inferno had begun not with explosives, but with silence. Each dawn, small reconnaissance drones rose like moths into the pale sky, their optical sensors sweeping along the Tarpenia route. They recorded movement, thermal signatures, and the subtle rhythm of Russian logistics. The analysts called it pattern of life intelligence, the art of reading habits. Trucks arrived at the same hour each week, escorted by armored vehicles, hugging the road's narrow spine between the ridges of Tokmak and Orikhiv. Nothing about it seemed urgent, yet everything about it was vital. Inside a camouflaged command shelter, the team known as Valkyrie 12 pieced together fragments of data. Each flicker on the thermal screen was logged, each deviation mapped. They were engineers, programmers, and soldiers bound by the same obsession, precision. Their tools were laptops wrapped in sandbags, thermal feeds from Lee, Zan 320 sensors, and an encrypted field radio that whispered like an old machine breathing through static. "Watch for the lead MTLB," said their commander, his voice low. "It carries the radar unit." That's the heart of their awareness. When that stops beating, the rest will stumble. The plan formed not in hours, but in accumulated patience. Every meter of the ambush zone was charted, every drone programmed to fly at a fixed altitude barely above the grass. The Ukrainian operators rehearsed in simulation until their fingers memorized the motion of detonation. To outsiders it might seem mechanical, but within that bunker, the tension was human, almost fragile. Each man and woman there knew the paradox of their craft, victory born from invisibility, destruction prepared in absolute calm. By the 10th day of surveillance, the pattern was complete. The convoy would pass between 450 and 500 hours. If they waited 1 minute too early, they risked exposure. 1 minute too late, and the convoy would clear the trap. The fog was forecast thick that morning. It was the perfect all-lights. Soft, impartial, and silent. When the final signal was sent to the operators lying in the brush, no one spoke. The waiting itself had become the weapon. The convoy appeared first as a blur of heat on the thermal screener. A chain of amber ghosts stretching 1.2 miles along the road. Through the monochrome glow, the operators could almost feel the weight of it, tons of steel, fuel, and confidence moving through fog as though the world were theirs. At the front, the MTLB trundled forward, its tracks chewing the wet soil. 26,000 pounds of armor and electronics, part radar, part mine clearer, part symbol of command. Behind it, two Ural 320 troop carriers followed, open backs crowded with soldiers wrapped in heavy coats, rifles resting against their knees. The heat signatures pulsed like beating hearts, 40 men unaware that they were already statistics in a different timeline. 6 more Ural 4320 cargo trucks formed the spine of the column. Their loads were more valuable than any life aboard. Boxes of RPG-7 launch tubes, MPADS, PKM, and PKT machine guns, saying 13,000 pounds of weapons destined for the front line. Each engine throbbed under the weight of modern war's heartbeat, supply. Further behind, rumbled 6 fuel trucks, sunk steel-skinned beasts carrying over 11,000 gallons of diesel. The heat they emitted made them glow white on the monitor, the thermal bloom of contained catastrophe. To the analysts, they were not vehicles, but opportunities, floating fuel-air bombs waiting for the right spot. 5 Kamaz 5350 ammunition carriers formed the rear echelon. Their cargo, hundreds of artillery shells, mortars, and rocket sound, was the kind of payload that could sustain a battalion for days. It could also, if struck correctly, obliterate itself in seconds. This paradox was the essence of modern supply, power, and vulnerability sharing the same chassis. Trailing behind came a small UAZ 452 ambulance and a single BTR-80, providing rear security. In doctrine, that pairing meant caution. In reality, it meant desperation. No one truly guards the back of a moving target. From above, the thermal map was a living anatomy of war. A head, a spine, a tail. Every element depended on the next. Sever the head, and the body falters. Strike the belly, and the explosion consumes everything around it. Inside the command post, Valkyrie 12 noted every spacing interval, every heat fluctuation. It was not hatred that guided Themar. It was geometry. The convoy's formation was a heartbeat on borrowed time, and the operators knew precisely where the pulse was weakest. The moment of choice arrived, not with fanfare, but with a long, measured silence. On the screen, the convoy rolled like a slow heartbeat, each thermal patch sliding past the crosshair. In the command shelter, the light from the monitors painted faces pale. The men and women of Valkyrie 12 were silhouettes in a room full of decisions. Outside, mist pressed against the grass like a hand. Inside, the calculus of war sat heavy on a single pair of shoulders, the commander. There are 2 kinds of strikes. There is the strike that snaps a link and gives a taste of victory. Fast, surgical, imperfect. It will cost less in time and in exposure, but it leaves openings and survivors. Then there is the strike that waits sound, patient, cruel, comprehensive fire, where the entire convoy is drawn into a pocket and reduced to wreckage. It offers the possibility of maximal effect, and with it, maximal risk. The commander reviewed the variables the way a surgeon checks instruments. There was the thermal picture, 21 vehicles, spaced unevenly over 1.2 miles. There was the weather, thick fog, providing concealment but also complicating visual confirmation. There was the intelligence on hand, Leibzan imagery showing the lead vehicle as an MTLB with a radar and mine-clearing switch. If that was neutralized, the convoy's situational awareness would collapse. There were the consequences. 2, operationally and morally. Sever the supply line and friendly units might gain days of breathing room. Strike early and some material would escape, but fewer civilian eyes might witness the carnage. Strike late and the cost would be total. But the window for detection by enemy air or electronic countermeasures widened. He thought of the men in those open-backed trucks, 40 souls huddled against cold, of the medics in the UAZ, of the rear BTR that would jam its guns against anything that moved. He thought also of the strategic ledger, the artillery, the fuel, the rockets, and access. One successful annihilation and whole days of battle would be reshaped. Hold, he said, once, a word that landed like a coin in the quiet. It was not indecision, it was commitment to a larger plan. They would not waste their assets on a partial blow. The operators ran through their sequences again. Drones armed, approach vectors verified, radio silence absolute. Each FPV pilot tightened straps and checked feed latency. The warheads were locked beneath tiny frames, waiting for the moment when technique would meet geometry. Waiting made their nerves thin. Waiting also sharpened their aim. If the convoy entered fully, the chain reaction of fuel to fire, munition to detonation would convert careful precision into overwhelming annihilation. If the enemy detected them first, the raid would become a massacre of their own making. Outside, the lead MTLB crested a small ridge and the drivers warmed their engines. In the bunker, the clock read 0458. The commander washed the thermal glow and exhaled a breath he had been holding for days. When the order came, the silence broke like a held breath. 12 frames lifted from the grass, in a motion so sudden it seemed choreographed. From the vantage of the operators, they were nothing more than black dots carving white streaks across the thermal map. In the field, they looked like a swarm of angry wasps. Small, fast, and terrifyingly precise. Each FPV drone had a role. 4 were designated punches-fast, angled attacks aimed at the lead MTLB to sever command and radar. 4 were inciter, SAR, aimed at the fuel trucks to generate conflagration and sympathetic detonations. The remainder were interdictors, targeting troop carriers, ammunition tarpaulins, and the rear security vehicle to prevent organized withdrawal and to raise the chaos threshold until unit cohesion collapsed. The strikes were timed to fractions of a second. Operators used pre-programmed vectors with manual override in the last second. Latency was the enemy they could not afford. When the first drone struck the MTLB, it did so at the engine bay, where critical electronics and the radar array lay semi-exposed. An 85mm shaped charge punched through composite armor. Hot metal and hydraulic fluid ignited. The command vehicle stopped. Its mast of awareness went dark. Once the head faltered, the choreography moved on. 2 punches dove into the nearest fuel truck. The initial impact punctured a pressurized tank. Fuel hissed and sprayed. A second drone's explosive impulse found the vapor and the detonation flowered upwards. The explosive yield of a single hit multiplied. Thermal pressure rolled across the road like an advancing wall. As flames licked the tarpaulins, sympathetic detonations followed. Shell stacks on the Kamaz carriers cooked off in a sequence A number 1, 2, then a cascading series as heat ruptured seals and detonators. The air became a theater of fire and shrapnel. Visibility collapsed under a black canopy. Any attempt at organized counterfire became impossible. Men were thrown from the geometry of battle into the chaotic physics of survival. Tactics mattered. Drones avoided obvious lines of small arms fire, favoring steep diving angles to defeat top-mounted machine guns and to exploit gaps in truck armor. Pilots adjusted on feed. If a target turned unexpectedly, a pre-designated secondary would take its place. Operators read the battlefield like musicians reading score, anticipating, correcting, improvising. Rescue and countermeasures were planned yet impotent. The BTR-80's guns roared, but found only smoke and silhouettes through which meaningful fire could not be placed. Medics ran to burning trucks and were pushed back by the blast wave. By the time the final quartet of drones struck in, disabling the last fuel source and rending the column's mobility, the convoy had ceased to be a formation and had become a graveyard of metal and flame. Within minutes, the kill pocket had fulfilled its logic. Communications severed, mobility obliterated, resupply erased. The choreography had been precise and merciless, a compact lesson in how economy of means and timing could convert a handful of platforms into strategic violence. By dawn, the road was no longer a route, but a scarron, blackened, smoking, twisted by heat. Through the drifting fog, columns of gray rose like monuments to precision. The Valkyrie 12 team watched from their command shelter, their faces lit by the residual glow on the thermal feed. No cheer, no celebration, only the quiet recognition that they had just rewritten an entire segment of the front line. The destruction of one convoy might seem, to the untrained eye, a tactical victory of limited scope. But, in the language of logistics, that single event was an earthquake. Along the Tokmaker-Robotyne-Yages Verbov axis, Russian supply flow depended on predictable rhythm. Fuel every 48 hours, ammunition every 72. Break that pattern, and the entire machine coughs, stalls, and loses momentum. For armored formations, delay is death. Within 6 hours, Ukrainian reconnaissance reported the first echoes: stalled tanks near Tokmak, idle artillery near Novoprokopivka, batteries running low on propellant charges. When ammunition belts thinned and fuel drums ran dry, commanders reduced fire missions by half. What began as a fireball on a provincial road now rippled outward as a silent shortage, the most invisible form of warfare. In staff headquarters, analysts plotted the knock-on effects. A brigade that loses a single day's resupply must adjust posture. A division that loses a week's will bleed initiative. The Russian cluster in Zaporizhzhia began pulling back its mechanized patrols, conserving what diesel remained. Even the drones they launched were rationed, their flight hours shortened to preserve scarce batteries. The Ukrainian side, observing from above, noted a rare phenomenon: stillness. There was also the psychological aftershock. Convoy drivers refused to move without additional escort. Repair crews demanded counter-drone protection that did not exist. What had once been routine became perilous. The myth of control fractured. The supply chain, once an artery, now felt like an open vein. From a doctrinal perspective, the ambush was a field demonstration of modern asymmetry. A few operators, a dozen FPV drones, and several kilograms of explosive had achieved what weeks of artillery could no dockers: operational paralysis. In the notebooks of the observers that night, one sentence was underlined twice: logistics is the new front line. As the fires burned out and satellite images spread through encrypted channels, the significance was unmistakable. The old equations of mass and cost were no longer sacred. The road outside Orikhiv had become a laboratory where the future of war was being tested, and it had passed its experiment with flame. While the smoke of Zaporizhzhia still curled into the pale sky, another theater began to stir hundreds of kilometers away. In the chill before dawn, on the 12th of October, new coordinates blinked on encrypted screens: Topper, Primorsk, the lifeline of oil and revenue, where pipelines met the Baltic wind. The same logic that had crippled the convoy would now be scaled to the size of a nation. The operation opened with decoys: a swarm of 200 AQ-400 drones, cheap, noisy, and expendable. They rose from scattered launch points across Ukraine, hugging the terrain to mask their radar signatures. Each one carried nothing more than a handful of electronics and a promise to make the enemy look the wrong way. Higher, above, the strike drones AN-19-6, Ludi models with thermobaric payloads waited, their flight paths plotted to exploit radar blind zones along the curvature of the Earth. Between them flew smaller FPV scouts, relaying imagery in bursts of silent light. At 0100 hours, the Nebo-M radar network in western Russia detected anomalies. What it saw were hundreds of false targets spilling across its horizon. Alerts flooded the Leningrad Air Defense Command. Sirens woke the night. Batteries of S-400 and Pantsir systems locked on and fired. For half an hour, the air over the Baltic shimmered with streaks of interceptor fire, a pyrotechnic illusion. Every missile launched into the night was one fewer left for what was coming. At 0320, with the missile reserves depleted and the gunners exhausted, the main assault arrived. Flying at ultra-low altitude over the sea, the AN-196 drones appeared only moments before impact. They struck in sequence. First the pumping station, then the control building, then the moored tankers along the jetty. The thermobaric blast from the first detonation collapsed the control facility, the heat igniting the pipelines like veins of flame. The second drone carved into a storage tank, releasing a rolling tide of burning oil. Within minutes, the port's command systems failed, alarms went silent, and the horizon became a wall of fire. Even from orbit, commercial satellites caught the bloom, two tankers burning like twin suns. Air traffic diverted, rescue boats turned away from the pier, and an entire export artery bled into the sea. The cost of the operation: a few hundred improvised drones, most of them decoys. The result? Paralysis of a critical oil route and the loss of millions in logistics and revenue. On every tactical channel, one conclusion spread: the swarm had spoken, and the age of concentrated defenses was dying. When the smoke settled above the Baltic, the analysts began to draw their quiet conclusions. What had looked like chaos in motion was, in fact, deliberate arithmetic, a new ledger of war where precision was measured not in caliber but in cost. The Primorsk operation had exposed a truth that no doctrine wished to admit. The mightiest shield can be undone not by stronger weapons, but by smarter arithmetic. For decades, modern air defenses had been built on the logic of superiority assay: intercept every threat, deny the sky, dominate altitude. Yet, the decoy swarm tore at that assumption. Every S-400 missile fired cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Every AQ-400 drone destroyed cost perhaps a few hundred. The ratio was absurd, the exchange catastrophic. These modern military equipment, the proud emblems of technological prestige, were now trapped in their own equations. The more they fired, the poorer they became. Radar horizon compounded the problem. At low altitude, over the curvature of the Earth, radar cannot see further than its line of sight. The Ukrainians had learned to exploit that limit with terrain-hugging flights. The Russians could only respond once the attackers were already within seconds of the target. It was a mathematical ambush, physics, weaponized as strategy. Another weakness was human. Systems built for centralized control falter under saturation. When hundreds of contacts appear at once, screens blur, operators hesitate. In those hesitations, swarms slip through. The defender's technology was magnificent but rigid, designed for a tempo the battlefield no longer obeyed. The cost-exchange logic extended beyond money. Every missile spent on a decoy drained morale as well as inventory. Every missed interception widened doubt in the system. The operators who once trusted their sensors began to second-guess the very images they saw. In warfare, that hesitation is the most expensive currency of all. On paper, Russia still possessed layers of air defense: AC radar, missiles, autocannons, electronic countermeasures. In reality, each layer now looked porous. The battlefield had become a marketplace of ingenuity, where low-budget innovation outbid high-budget perfection. For military theorists, the implications were immediate: doctrine must evolve or die. Across staff, colleges, and simulation rooms, strategists began rewriting equations. How many decoys equal one radar? How many cheap drones to exhaust a battery? The questions sounded academic, but their answers would define survival. The future was not a duel of giants. It was a contest of economies, of minds, nimble enough to turn mathematics into momentum. Long after the fires at Primorsk faded, their reflections still glowed on the walls of briefing rooms across the world. Military academies, defense ministries, and think tanks all replayed the footage, searching not for victory or defeat, but for the logic beneath it. A handful of inexpensive machines had undermined billions worth of infrastructure, forcing the guardians of conventional power to ask a disquieting question: what does dominance mean when it can be undone by a toolbox and code? Doctrine, once anchored in mass and hierarchy, now had to bend to fluidity. The commanders who once counted battalions began to count frequencies and bandwidth. The essence of warfare shifted from possession to perception, hour to who could see, adapt, and act first. In this new drama, a drone operator with a laptop became a strategist, a sensor array became a weapon, and data became ammunition. Ukraine's field innovation was less a miracle than a model. Decentralized control, fast feedback, iterative design. A drone crash today meant a stronger drone tomorrow. Factories were replaced by workshops, generals by engineers. These modern military equipment, assembled from civilian parts and sharpened by necessity, embodied a new virtue, agility. They were not monuments of industry, they were symptoms of evolution. Other nations took note. Some sought to replicate, others to counter, all to understand. Defense budgets that once poured into aircraft carriers and armored divisions now diverted millions into autonomous systems, anti-drone nets, and electronic deception. The war had become a laboratory, and every explosion was an experiment. Yet beneath the excitement of innovation lay unease. When destruction becomes affordable, who controls its spread? When the sky fills with swarms, where is the line between soldier and civilian, between precision and chaos? Ethics, once a chapter at the end of strategy manuals, returns to the first page. The tools of survival had outpaced the rules of conduct. For the men and women who planned the Zaporizhzhia ambush, doctrine was personal. They had seen what a few hands and circuit boards could achieve. They knew the power of invisibility, the weight of responsibility. To them, progress was not pride, it was burden. In the silence after the strike, they looked not at their success, but at what it meant. The battlefield had changed shape, and so had the soul of those who fought upon it. The age of mass had ended, the age of intelligence had begun. Dawn came slowly over a landscape rewritten by fire. What had once been a supply road was now a charred corridor of twisted steel, and what had once been a thriving port was a scar along the Baltic coast. Yet, within that destruction lay a lesson cold, lucid, unavoidable. The age of dominance through sheer scale was gone. The age of precision, intelligence, and agility had arrived. Every war writes its own scripture. The Zaporizhzhia ambush and the Primorsk strike have already etched a new chapter into that ancient text, one where a handful of operators with headsets and courage can unmake an empire's certainty. It is not strength that decides the outcome now, but comprehension, the ability to see and adapt faster than the opponent can react. Across command rooms, officers re-evaluate the very tools they once trusted. Military equipment is no longer judged by weight, armor, or range, but by its capacity to think, to sense, to deceive. The battlefield has become an algorithmic theater, the soldier an interpreter of data. The armies that thrive will not be those who possess the most, but those who understand the most. For the veterans watching these reports, there is a familiar ache. They know that every advancement carries a debtors, a price paid not in numbers, but in names. The quiet courage of the Valkyrie 12 team, the faces we never see on screen, remind us that beneath every innovation lies a beating human heart. Technology may transform the means, but it never replaces the meaning. In the final count, military equipment is not the essence of power, it is the extension of will. Whether it flies, drives, or hums in orbit, it remains a mirror of the people who build and wield it. Each circuit, each code line, carries a fragment of belief that intelligence can defend freedom, that light, even when small, can still cut through darkness. And so, as the world stares into this new dawn of mechanized intellect, the final truth stands clear. Wars will still be fought, borders will still be tested, but the measure of civilization will be found in restraint, in knowing when not to strike and when to remember what we fight for. Military equipment will evolve, but the human spirit must remain its compass. They came before dawn, as silent like a lung of mist exhaled across the road.